Hey there everyone, it's Baka here, and welcome to a special weekend workshop, though these workshops may not specifically be on the weekends for the time being. I've been getting this request a lot in real life, that while people have seemingly enjoyed the tutorials that I've been giving in drawing, where I have used Adobe Photoshop to show these different methods, they have actually been asking for a tutorial in how to use Photoshop itself. So that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a series of videos here that teach you how to use Photoshop, at least just the basics of Photoshop. So to start off, before I open anything up, I want you to notice that the version of Photoshop I am using is Adobe Photoshop CS3. Now this is by no means the latest version of Photoshop. That would be CSS, which is kind of like Photoshop CS7. But for the sake of what I am planning to teach, it does not really matter. So let's go ahead and get started with this. The very first thing I want to do before showing what any of the tools are in here are simply to go through and talk about opening a new document. So the easiest, well, maybe not the easiest way, but the most straightforward way to do this is under File, up in the upper left-hand corner, and New. This will open up a new document window. I'm going to cancel this for right now so I can show you another way to do this. And I'm going to be referring a lot to keyboard shortcuts. Now a lot of these are the same ones that have been around since MS-DOS, way back in the day. Now the way I do this is I use keyboard shortcuts a lot because it saves time on a lot of different things. And the easiest way to open up a new document if you're using a PC version of Adobe Photoshop is to hit Control-N. If you're using an Apple, it's Apple-N. And it does the same exact thing. Now, when you're in here, you can do things like you can name your file. Its default is set as Untitled1, which means that when you go to save it, it's going to ask you to name it then. Normally, I just leave this alone so that I can figure out what I want to save it as later. For the sake of this video, I'm going to go ahead and call this Intro. Mostly because I don't know that I'm going to need to keep this file afterwards. Now, underneath it, it's got a preset, which is automatically set to custom. And if you go under there, it's got default Photoshop size, US paper, which would be 8.5 inches by 11 inches, international paper, which I'm not sure on, photo, which I'm not sure on, web, mobile devices, film and video, and then back to custom. I keep it on custom so I can control how things are. Underneath that, you have width, height, resolution, color mode, and background contents. Width, obviously it says 5, and then it's got inches. There are different things that you can change it to: pixels, inches, centimeters, millimeters, points, picas, and columns. Height, it has the same thing. Since I'm an American, I think better in inches. Now what this means is this is going to be the physical size when you go to print this out. So this is set to 5 by 3. I'm going to go ahead and make this 8 inches wide by 10 inches tall. This is not quite the height of a regular piece of letter paper, but it's a good even height. Now, resolution, what this specifically means is on your screen, you are going to have it be set to 8 by 10, but it's going to appear larger or smaller depending on the resolution. And what the resolution means here, this is 150 pixels per inch, which can be changed to pixels per centimeter as well, but if you're using inches, why would you use pixels per centimeter? Now, 72 pixels per inch is the standard for web. Higher than that is when you get into print, and I would say 150 is probably the minimum you want for a print job. 300 is a very good size. You get over that and Photoshop will start to really slow down. Now if you want super high quality prints and you've got the video processor and the RAM for it, you can go up to 500 pixels per inch. If you're going that high, you might be using the wrong program. You might want to use something like Illustrator. For my sake, I'm going to leave this at 150 pixels per inch. Now color mode, you have RGB color here, and you can change that to bitmap, grayscale, RGB, CMYK, and lab color. Now the three that you might choose from are grayscale, RGB, and CMYK. CMYK is the standard for professional printing jobs. So if you're going to be sending something to a batch printer, something that you're going to have professionally printed, and they're going to use a 4-color process to print it, you need to make your document in CMYK. If you're going to do something for the screen primarily, you're going to want RGB. Red, green, blue, or cyan, magenta, yellow, black in CMYK's case. Grayscale is exactly what it sounds like. It's shades of gray. Bitmap is black and white only, and it's really pixely. And lab color, I don't honestly mess with. Now you have the choices of 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit. The standard is 8-bit, honestly, so I just leave it as that. Now background contents is where things can get a little tricky. I have this set right now to white. If you have it set like that, when you open the document, it's going to give you, you'll have the chance to see a layer. And it will say background, and it will be italicized, and it will be locked. If you set it to background color, it's not going to be locked, and it's not going to specifically be the background, or if it is, that background will be whatever the background color is that you already have set. Transparent will mean that it will be an unlocked layer. It'll be just like any other layer, and you could eventually do other things to it. I'm going to leave it as white for now so I can show you something later. Now if I open up advanced, it gives me color file and pixel aspect ratio. There's a difference between square pixels and all of these other options. I prefer to leave this as square pixels, mostly because I understand square pixels and I've never really played with any of these others. I don't generally open advanced. Same thing with color profile. There's a lot to choose from. I'm going to be leaving it as the standard, the sRGB. You know, if I were working with something else, if I were doing something for Kodak stuff or with NTSC, which is a lot of video stuff, I might change it. But what's the point? Yours might look a little different depending on what codecs and stuff you have on your computer. So I have this as intro, 8x10 at 150 pixels per inch in RGB with a white background. I'm going to hit OK, and once my computer works and pulls up the document, you're going to see what this looks like. So here is the document, and I just move this over to center it just so I can work a little easier. So this is not a standard thing when you first use Photoshop to have these rulers at the top and along the left side. I always use these though because it helps me keep track of where things are when I'm working. To access these, you can go up to View, and then they have rulers, or you can just hit Control R. That will also pop these up. So now what I want to do, that we have an open document, I want to take a look around the user interface of Photoshop. And now normally you would think to start from left to right. I'm actually going to start along the right side. And what I have done to mine is, and you can switch up some of these things under Window. You have a lot of options. What I've done is I have left the options that are most likely to be used. So, and something's messed up here where Well, that's kind of weird, but it's not that necessary. So I'm going to start over here under Navigator. Now, if you do not have this expanded, Navigator looks like a little ship's wheel, the navigator's wheel, if you will. And if you click on that, it brings you up a thumbnail of your document. And underneath it, there's a slider bar. This is set to 50% zoom. And it's got these things that look like small mountains and large mountains. And I like to use those because it will incrementally shrink or enlarge my document. Notice if I go over that 50%, there's a red square in the Navigator that tells you what's actually being shown. Little scroll bars have appeared on there. And the more you zoom in, the smaller that square gets because you're looking at something at a much more magnified level. But for this, 50% is smack dab in the middle. Now, Histogram and Info, I honestly don't really use at all. Histogram I might every now and then. And the Info, it gives me specific little bits of knowledge. Like this is telling me where I am on the XY axis. It tells me how big the document is. So if you're making a document and it seems huge, you can tell there. Now underneath that, I have color, swatches, and styles. Colors, this is one way to get your colors going. You can use these slider bars and you can change what your foreground color is, or if I click on the background color, I can choose what that's going to be. You can also double click those colors and it'll bring up this window, but I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Swatches are areas of predetermined colors. And you can add to these. You can create a new swatch. And this is for the foreground color. And that'll bring you back up to that same window basically, but you'll save it as a swatch. So if you're doing a document where you're only going to be using some specific colors, but you need to use those ones very specifically, this is a fast way to get to that. Now styles, honestly I don't touch this because a lot of these styles are pretty bad. So there's no real need for them. Now the next tool on this right hand toolbar is by far what I consider to be the most important. And that is the layers. And I expanded this because the last few tools are right in here. Layers is the most important thing to remember when you're working in Photoshop. And I'm going to have a video specifically about these layers. But you notice this one, it's white. This is our background layer. It specifically says that. And it's got a lock that is completely locked. You can not do anything with this layer as is. Now you can do stuff on this layer. I can use different tools like brush tools and I can draw on this layer, but they're on this layer and can't really do much about that. Now channels and paths are for more advanced things, and paths doesn't show up because there's nothing, you have to actually make the path for it to show up. Channels is some different ways of controlling colors and whatnot on specific layers, but other than that, you're probably never going to, well, you might use that once you get into more advanced. Now if you're on the layers menu, there's a lot of these things down here which I will get into at a later point. The one thing I will mention is this one in the very lower right hand corner, and if you hover over it, it says create new layer. It basically looks like a square within a square. If I click that, it gives me a transparent layer which looks like it has a little checkerboard pattern. It says layer 1. This is a layer, think of it as if the background is a white piece of paper and each layer is a piece of transparency sheet that is laying on top. And each time you put a new layer and it's on top in this list, It is physically on top of the layer beneath it. So if I draw something on this layer, it will literally be under whatever is drawn on a layer that is above it. And this is a great way to work when you're in Photoshop. In fact, it's generally the best way to work. But as I said, I'm going to get into layers at a different point. The next thing I want to do, and normally this is all one kind of toolbar over here, and something messed up with my Photoshop, so it's set in 2 toolbars. And there's really only one thing over here that I want to show you, and that is the top. This is your history. And you can expand these windows and whatnot just like this. Now your history is great because while you can undo things by hitting Control Z, it only goes back one step. Now there are different things you can do like Alt Z, which will let you go back step by step by step. But I don't like using those. I would prefer to go back into the history, or I can go back in as many steps. Well, not as many steps as I want. There's a set limit, but there's a lot that you can undo. Now, you'll notice I have layer 1 and I have background layer. And in my history, I have new and new layer. If I click on new, it takes away that last one. So I now only have a background layer over here. But because I haven't done anything yet, I can always go back to new layer and it brings it right back. This is a handy little thing. So we will come back to some of these other things later, but for right now I'm going to switch sides to the left hand side to what I'm going to call the true toolbar, because this is where all of, well, if not all, but most of your tools that you will use when using Photoshop are. And I'm just going to kind of go through these fairly quickly to tell you what they do. The top tool is the Move tool, and if you have that clicked, whatever layer you're on, you can start moving things around with that. You cannot move things around unless you have the Move tool selected. You can't move anything on the background layer though. Now the nice thing about this is you can physically move it by clicking and dragging with your mouse, or you can use the arrow keys to move things, and you can get really minute movements out of that. You can get really precise movements, especially if you're zoomed in a lot, then you can really see what you're doing. Underneath that are the marquee tools. And if you click and kind of hold it for a second, you'll bring up anything that's in a sub-menu. So this one, the default is a rectangular marquee tool. Underneath that you have elliptical marquee tool, single row, and single column. What these are is if I click and drag in my document, it'll create a kind of flashing dotted line thing. This is my selection tool. I'm selecting things. So if I had a bunch of stuff in here, I could select that, and then if I move, it's only going to move the things that are within that. So you can do it in squares, you can do it in kind of a circular object. You know, you can make that really circular, you can make it oval, etc., etc. Now, underneath that are the different lasso tools. Now, these 3 lasso tools are very different. The original lasso tool, you have to click and hold in, and then as you drag your mouse around, you are going to be able to lasso things in, and this is creating a kind of selection. And when you get back to the original point, it will connect. Now, if I were just to do this much and I let go, it's going to connect my last point to my first point. I don't usually use the lasso tool, the regular lasso tool, because I don't trust my own hands. What I use most of all is the polygonal lasso tool. And this makes things really easy, especially if you zoom in on something that you need to select. Or let's say you're editing a photo and you need to cut a photo out from the background. This is a great tool to use, because what you can do is you can click once and you'll notice a little circle pops up on my little icon there, and I move a little bit, and if you watch, if I move, it's a straight line. Each thing I do with this polygonal lasso is a straight line, but I can set little anchor points with my lasso. So I click once, and now my line moves from that point. Oops, that was unintentional. So I click once, I click again, I click again, I click again. And if I click things closer together, I can get, while not a true rounded edge, I can get something that starts to look rounded, especially if you're zoomed in. Now, you can tell when you get back to the beginning because it does give you that circle again, and you get something like that. Now again, if I'm out here and I just want to say, oh, I need to go back to the beginning, I can double click and it'll bring you back. Now when it made a mistake there, it registered a click as a double click, and that does sometimes happen. The magnetic lasso, I'm not even going to really show in motion because I have nothing in this document, but it has this thing where as long as you've got solid lines and you don't have anything fuzzy, like let's say you're editing a photo of a person, that's not usually a good choice because hair especially, or clothes, or whatnot in the body might confuse it. But as long as you follow close to your lines, it's supposed to make anchor points on its own. So you click once and you start slowly going around your thing. It doesn't work very well. I hate this tool. People try to use this a lot and it fails them miserably. Underneath that, you've got two things. You've got the quick selection tool and the magic wand tool. Now the quick selection tool, I'm not a big fan of. It just doesn't do what I want. But I love the magic wand tool. This is one of my most used tools when I am doing digital illustration. I need to quickly fill in an area with color, because I'll be using things and I'll have line art on there that'll be crisp and clear and done in Photoshop. I can just use this to, well, I'll skip ahead a little just to say do this. So I've got this big magenta line going on. If I use the magic wand tool, I can click inside of it and it's going to select everything that's within those lines. And then I can fill this in with a color, or I could delete what's inside of it and whatnot. So, whoa, what did I just do there? Okay, I just went back in the history. That surprised me a little. So moving on, you've got the crop tool, and it does exactly what you would think the crop tool should do. You can select the area you need cropped, and you'll notice the white part is what's going to be kept. You can shrink or expand this. It's going to be rectangular. If you hit enter, it's automatically going to crop. If you click on one of the tools on the toolbar, it'll bring you up this option. Do you want to crop this image? Crop, cancel, don't crop. I'm going to hit cancel. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to hit crop. This brings us back to normal. Underneath that is the slice tool and the slice select tool. We're going to leave this alone for now because this is an advanced tool. Now underneath that, the thing that looks like a band-aid is the healing brush. You also have a spot healing brush, a patch, and a red eye tool. These are very good tools when you are doing photo editing, especially when you have, let's say you have a photo and people have gotten red eye. Well, you can use that red eye tool to change things. Healing brush tool, you are quasi copying and pasting. Same with the spot healing brush tool. But you're able to softly kind of blend things together. So these are the healing brush and the spot healing brush are very good for later editing phases. Underneath that are the brush, pencil, and color replacement tool. I will be honest, of these three, I only ever use the brush tool, and you just saw me use it once. If you have this on, this is what you can go ahead and draw things with, and it's just clicking and dragging, kind of like that lasso tool, but you know, it does different things. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you have this brush tool up top underneath your main menu, you have brush, and this one says 5. There's a little down arrow. You can change the diameter of your brush. So if I put this to 49 and I bring it over here, you can see how much bigger that is. If you want, you can change the hardness. A hardness of 100 means you're going to have a nice solid outline to your brush. A hardness of 0 means you're going to have a soft outline. So it's more like what's the word? It's more like spray paint or airbrushing. That's what I'm thinking. Now back in that same menu, you can scroll down. You've got different sizes, different hardnesses. And then as you get near the bottom, they start to get really different. You get these kind of cluster forms, which they show you the brush, and it's not completely solid, but it's kind of. But the cool thing about this is, if I'm going to make this bigger so you can see this clearly, if I just click once, it gives me like a splatter paint. I use this in different applications. A lot of these more crazy brushes I won't ever use, because there are some really bad ones like this. I don't know why you would ever want to use this, and I've had students in the past use that brush for a website, or this one, which is kind of the same, but there's no control to it. A leaf? Yeah, let's make a bunch of leaves. That looks real. You can tell I'm slightly cynical about these brushes because I think they're ridiculous. This one is really kind of silly, but there you go. Stars. It's like you're in a box of Lucky Charms. But you go on and on and on, and you can download new brushes. Like some of these brushes that I have in here at the very end are ones that I've gone and downloaded. Because I know that they're going to give me a certain style. So some of them don't look all that different from normal, but you get the idea. It's a lot of learning Photoshop is just playing with it. Now underneath this is what I consider the most important tool for photo editing, and that is the clone stamp tool. I'm ignoring the pattern stamp tool because pattern is the operative word in there, and when you're editing something, you don't really want to set patterns. But the clone stamp tool, what it does is it will, and again, you have the kind of brush option for sizes. So you can make that bigger, but if you hold in Alt, it gives you a crosshair. And you can click once with that, and then you can go to another place, and it is sampling where you hit the crosshair. And it is copying that, and it is pasting it to this new place. So if I move the mouse, though, the crosshair will move equally with it. And so I'm copying and pasting as I go along. So if I'm trying to edit something out of a photo, this is a nice first tool to use because it'll get me what I need. And I will show you a lot of this stuff later because I'll do a video on photo editing. Underneath that is the history brush and the art history brush tool. I really need to bone up on these ones because I don't know really what they do. And I've been using Photoshop for 14 years now. The eraser tool has things, background eraser tool, magic eraser tool. They all kind of do the same thing. The eraser tool should be fairly obvious what it does. It erases. It especially basically erases your brushes. And you can do the same thing. You can make the size of this bigger or smaller and have a hardness from 0 to 100. Underneath that, you've got two tools that are very important. The gradient tool and the paint bucket tool. Now the paint bucket tool does exactly what you think it would do. It fills in. It's also known as a fill tool. I call it the paint bucket tool. Well, that's because what Photoshop calls it. Illustrator would call this the fill tool. It fills in the area. The gradient tool is pretty fun. It's also really badly used a lot. This is one where it will go from your foreground color to your background color in some different set ways that you can see up at the top left of your screen. The first one, if you click and drag it, you're going to get something like that. The second one is a radial. It's going to give you something like that. This one's really just weird, and I don't use it much. This one gives you this gradient with your foreground color being a core on the inside. And the last one is kind of a star. So those are interesting. The blur tool, the sharpen tool, the smudge tool. The blur tool will take away some of the edges, and the nice thing about this is you can change the brush size and you can change the strength from 10% to where you, if you're just trying to tweak things just a little bit, all the way up to 100%. And you might not notice things that much on something like this, but if you click and you kind of drag your mouse over this, it will slowly blur things. It's not going to do that much on a gradient though. The sharpen tool is kind of the opposite of the blur tool. It's supposed to sharpen those edges and lines up, but again, you're not going to notice much on a gradient. The smudge tool is a fun and horribly misused little tool where if I click and drag, let's say from the center of this, I can start literally just smudging things in that area. So, you know, I can make little branches and whatnot coming off of this. You know, I can go back and forth and do some really weird things. You'll notice Photoshop's trying to catch up with me. Underneath that are the dodge, burn, and sponge tool. The dodge and burn tool are kind of nice. They make things lighter or darker. They take away color, or they lighten things up, really. It's not really about the color, it's about the lightness. The burn tool will bring back that darkness, or will make things even darker. So I'll just click a bunch in that area, and you can see I'm not adding any color because it doesn't do anything in the white. But where there's color, it's going to darken that up. The pen tool is a more advanced tool that we'll not get into in this. The text tool, a lot of people won't use text from Photoshop because, whoa, that was weird. They won't use text from Photoshop because this is a pixel, it is a rasterized math setting to this. And they don't want to have pixels in their text. For most things, it doesn't matter. Now, up at the top, you have your choice of different fonts. Some fonts you're able to do things like make a bold or italicize. You can change the size. You can change this option. You can change the alignment, the color of the text. You can create warped text, which I'm not going to show in this video. But there are two ways of doing this. You can create a text box by clicking and dragging with your text tool, which means your text will only show up in this box. If you go over it, you're going to have to fix your box. The other option is you just click. Then you have no text box, and you can make this as long as you want to or as tall as you want to. It's up to you. So there's that. Now, the rest of these tools, the path selection tool, the direct selection tool, those go along with the pen tool. The shape tool this can be pretty interesting because this takes into account some math that is not native to Photoshop. It's vector math. It's the type of math that you'll find in things like Illustrator. But you can create different shapes, and there are some really basic ones. I use the line tool a lot. I use that in the perspective drawing lessons. You can do this custom shape tool, and at the top of the screen there's a little drag down that's got a bunch of different shapes. This is, I think, just this just says small thumbnail. That doesn't really matter. But you've got a number of different categories that you can choose from, and you can put in different shapes. I guess for just to show you, I'll put in a rounded rectangle shape, and this is again a click and drag thing, and boom, it gives me a big pink rectangle. The notes tool, I've never used it in all these years, so shows you the importance of that. The eyedropper tool is a nice one, especially if you're switching back and forth between specific colors and you don't have swatches. So I can put this over the gray, and it will turn my foreground color gray. I can put it over the magenta, and it will turn it magenta, or pink, or whatever you want to call this color. What is this, the selector tool? The hand tool. I honestly don't know what this tool does. And you have the zoom tool. So I use the Navigator for this. You can use this. You can click and it will start zooming in and center on whatever you have your thing. If you hold in Alt, that plus changes to a minus and it will zoom out. Now the last two things I want to show you in this video are your foreground and background color panels. The top one is always your foreground color. The back one is always your background color. You can switch these with this little arrow, and if you double click in these, you're going to get this. And you can, within this window you can change lightness and darkness and some of the hues. You can use this scroller to change between a bunch of different colors. That would be really too bright. You can hit OK. You can add to swatches. You can do some different things. You can, if you know specific colors, like if you have a Pantone guide, which shows you what specific colors are that are standards, you can put in their math measurements of RGB or CMYK, and you can get that color exactly. So you can hit OK and it changes things. So if I put if I put that brush tool on, I can now get this green. You'll notice that you can't see my stuff that's underneath this pink, because on my layer menu, that pink shape is on top. The layer menu is down near the bottom. So that's going to do it for this tutorial. This was a lot longer tutorial because trying to show you the basic tools and what they do. Now, the next tutorial will be on layer management, which is probably the most important thing you can know about using Photoshop. After that, we're going to get into a few simplistic little projects on using Photoshop. And then I hope you guys go out and explore. If you have Photoshop, play with it. If you don't have Photoshop, a lot of people can't afford it. You can go and download the program GIMP. Now, GIMP is a freeware program. It's not quite up to par with Photoshop, but you can do a lot of the same sorts of things, and the user interface is very similar. So, until the next time we have one of these videos, I hope you've learned a lot. I hope you come back for more. And until next time, this is Bach, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.